James Hartley sat at his desk, the soft glow of morning light creeping through the glass windows of his penthouse apartment. He should have felt content. He had it all. The sleek design of his home, the city skyline stretching beyond, the accolades from a successful tech career. He had checked all the boxes, but as he stared out at the bustling city below, a hollow emptiness gnawed at his chest. It was a feeling that no amount of wealth, no high-profile meetings could fill. His gaze drifted across the room to the photo on his desk, a picture of him holding Mia, his newborn daughter. The memory of that day still felt like a dream. The hospital room filled with the soft hum of machines and the warmth of new life. Mia's tiny hand had wrapped around his finger, and he had known, in that moment, that nothing would ever matter more than her. But now, that image of joy and promise felt like a distant memory, a ghost of a life he no longer recognized. 5 years had passed since the divorce. 5 years of missed birthdays, first days of school, and little moments that slipped away, never to return. He hadn't been a part of Mia's life since the bitter custody battle that had fractured everything. Instead of the joy of fatherhood, he had been left with the emptiness of seeing his daughter's milestones through photos and the sterile words of legal documents. The distance between them had only grown with each passing year, and every attempt to bridge that gap had been met with failure. His thumb hovered over his phone screen as he scrolled through photos of Mia, now 7 years old. There was a picture of her at her last birthday, a beautiful girl in a pink dress, standing beside Celeste, her mother. But something was wrong. Mia's smile, usually so radiant, was tight, almost unnatural. Her eyes didn't sparkle with the same mischief he remembered. It was as if her innocence had been stolen, replaced with a guarded maturity far beyond her years. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization settling over him like a thick fog. He had tried to convince himself that staying away was the right thing to do. He had let Celeste control the narrative, convinced that his absence would spare Mia the pain of conflict. But what had that really accomplished? Had he been protecting her, or was he just protecting himself from the guilt of being a father who couldn't do enough? The notification on his phone blinked again, Mia's birthday reminder. The same gift he had ordered sat waiting in the back of his mind, a delicate charm bracelet with a star pendant, meant to symbolize her bright future. But it felt meaningless, a hollow gesture. The bracelet wasn't going to fix things. The bracelet wasn't going to bring back the years lost. His phone rang. It was his assistant, Sarah. "James," she began, her voice a little hesitant. "Linda Matthews called the office today. She saw Celeste at a fundraiser over the weekend. She mentioned that Mia's artwork was being auctioned." James sat up straighter, his breath caught in his throat. Linda Matthews. She had been a close friend of Celeste's, someone who had been a part of their lives before everything had fallen apart. What fundraiser? What auction? James's fingers froze over the phone screen as he pulled up the details. He hadn't expected to find anything new, but his heart lurched when he saw the photos from the event. There, standing in front of a display of children's art, was Celeste, her face plastered in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And beside her was Mia. Mia looked different. Gone was the joyful, carefree expression he remembered from when she was younger. Her hair was neatly styled, and her dress was perfectly pressed. But there was something about the way she stood, rigid, unnatural. Her smile was small, barely a flicker of what it should have been. And her eyes, those eyes that used to be full of curiosity and wonder, were now flat. They seemed to hold a story of pain, of someone who had been through more than a 7-year-old should. James's stomach twisted as he zoomed in on her face. His daughter's gaze was distant, detached, as if she were a stranger to him. His pulse quickened. How could this have happened? When did his little girl become someone who wore a mask so convincingly? He scrolled through more photos, his mind racing. Celeste's grip on Mia's shoulder was too tight, her fingers digging into the fabric of Mia's dress. It was the kind of touch that was supposed to offer comfort, but instead felt more like ownership, as though Mia had to remain in place, perfectly still, under her mother's control. James closed the app and let out a shaky breath. This wasn't right. He hadn't seen Mia in person for over a year. And now, after all this time, he was just another figure in her life, a name on a legal document, a distant memory. But this was something he couldn't ignore. His daughter was hurting, and he was doing nothing about it. He stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and walked over to the window. The city stretched out before him, a landscape of bright lights and endless possibilities. But in his heart, he knew something had to change. He had to change. His fingers flew over the keyboard, booking a flight to Cincinnati, where Celeste had moved with Mia after the divorce. He hadn't seen them since that painful day in court. He had promised himself he wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't fight for custody anymore. But now, as he stared out at the world below him, the weight of his own silence felt unbearable. He had been a passive observer of his daughter's life, and it was time to step up. He packed a bag quickly, stuffing clothes into a suitcase without thinking twice. What if Mia didn't recognize him? What if she didn't want to see him? What if Celeste tried to block him? The doubts swirled in his mind, but none of them were strong enough to outweigh the fear of doing nothing. As he slid into his car, the darkness of the night wrapping around him, he whispered under his breath, "Hold on, baby girl. Daddy's coming." The road ahead seemed long, and the distance between him and his daughter felt insurmountable. But for the first time in years, James Hartley felt a sense of purpose, a quiet determination to fix the broken pieces of their family, even if he wasn't sure how it would all turn out. James's rental car coasted down Maple Grove Drive as the afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the manicured lawns. Each house seemed like a picture-perfect replica of the one before it, impeccably maintained, with symmetrical gardens and freshly painted exteriors. It all felt too polished, too pristine. Everything about this neighborhood screamed control. It was as if the families who lived here were part of some unspoken agreement to present only their best selves, with no room for imperfection. He had arrived in Cincinnati just hours earlier, the long drive from the airport a blur of anxious thoughts. The unfamiliar city, its neat streets, and the soft hum of suburban life felt surreal to him. It was a far cry from the chaotic, ambitious world he had once lived in, where work was everything and personal connections came second. His focus had always been on success, on building something that would last. But now, as he made his way down this quiet street, it was clear that the thing he had built, the family he had once dreamed of, had slipped through his fingers. James didn't know what he expected when he finally decided to make this visit. Maybe he had imagined some grand emotional reunion. Maybe he had hoped for an apology from Celeste or an explanation for what had happened to Mia. But now, as he parked the car a few houses down from Celeste's home, all those thoughts seemed distant and irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was getting to his daughter. He sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the house in front of him. The house looked just as he remembered from when they had lived here together. Clean, orderly, with no signs of chaos or disorder. Celeste had always been that way, obsessed with perfection, with creating an image of an ideal family life. But in that image, James had never truly fit in. He had been the constant workaholic, always absent when Mia needed him. His heart twisted at the thought. How many years had he spent climbing ladders and chasing deadlines, all while his little girl was growing up without him? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone vibrating on the passenger seat. He grabbed it quickly, his pulse quickening as he saw a message from Sarah, his assistant. "James, I know you're busy, but I wanted to remind you to stay focused. This is important. Mia needs you more than anything right now." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah's reminder brought everything into sharp focus. It wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. He couldn't keep avoiding the truth. He couldn't keep pretending he wasn't a part of Mia's life. He had to show up, even if it meant facing the difficult truth about how much damage had been done. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, his shoes sinking slightly into the soft grass beneath him. The air was crisp with the scent of fresh-cut lawns and blooming flowers, but it felt foreign to him. Nothing here was familiar anymore. His hand tightened around the door handle as he walked toward the front door. As he reached the doorstep, he hesitated for a moment. He had spent years thinking about this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to approach it. Should he knock? Should he just walk in? The house felt so cold, so controlled. There was no warmth in it, no indication of the chaos that surely lay beneath the surface. He pressed the doorbell. The chime echoing inside the house. It was loud and intrusive, and it made his heart race. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was it. There was no going back now. Footsteps approached from inside, and the door opened slowly. The woman who stood in front of him looked familiar. Maria, the housekeeper. She had been part of the household staff since before the divorce, a constant presence in the background of their lives. Her wide eyes locked onto his, and he could see the recognition in her gaze. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, clutching her cleaning cloth with a nervous energy. Her unease was palpable, as if she wasn't sure how to handle this unexpected visitor. James felt a pang of guilt at her discomfort. He didn't belong here. He hadn't been a part of this world for so long. "Mrs. Hartley isn't home," Maria said, her voice thick with an accent that made her words sound distant, foreign. I don't know if I should let you in." "I'm not here to see Celeste," James said softly, his voice gentler than he had expected. "I just want to see Mia. I'm her father." Maria's eyes widened, and James could see the conflict in her face. He didn't blame her for being hesitant. Celeste's house had always been a carefully curated space, and she didn't like surprises. She liked control. He could only imagine how this sudden appearance from her ex-husband, after years of silence, would shake her. But he wasn't here for Celeste. He was here for Mia. After what felt like an eternity, Maria stepped back, her expression softening. "I don't know," she muttered, almost to herself. "Please, just a few minutes." James nodded, grateful. "I won't take long. I promise." As Maria led him into the house, James's senses were assaulted by the overwhelming smell of furniture polish and lavender. The house was spotless, everything arranged with precision. It was sterile, almost clinical. There was no trace of the warmth he had once known here. He couldn't help but wonder how much of that was Celeste's doing. How much of this environment was a reflection of her need to maintain control over everything, including the way Maya lived. They walked down the hallway, and James's heart began to race. He had no idea what he was walking into. He had no idea how Maya would react. Would she remember him? Would she even want to see him? He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he passed the empty rooms, each one perfectly neat, devoid of the life and energy that should have filled them. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, stuck in a perfect image that had long ago lost its meaning. And Mia, his little girl, was part of that image, a piece of perfection that had been carefully curated and controlled. At the end of the hallway, Maria stopped in front of a closed door. She turned to James, her expression guarded. "Mia's in her room," she said quietly. "I'll leave you alone for a moment, but Mrs. Hartley will be home soon." James nodded, though he could hardly hear her words over the pounding of his heart in his ears. He stood in front of the door for a moment, unsure of what to do next. This was the moment of truth. Would Maya still see him as her father, or was he a stranger now? He pushed the door open slowly. And there, in the middle of the room, was his daughter. The door creaked open, and for a moment, James stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. There, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was his daughter, Mia. She was just as beautiful as he remembered, though so much had changed. Her long brown hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she wore a soft pink sweater that seemed too small for her now. But it was the way she was sitting that caught his attention. She was hunched over, focused on something in her lap, her small hands working carefully, almost methodically, as if she were trying to perfect something she had been told was important. She didn't notice him immediately. Her gaze was fixed on whatever task she had set for herself. It wasn't until the soft click of the door behind him that Maya looked up. Her big brown eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to freeze, as if the years that had passed between them had not been measured in days but in lifetimes. Mia's eyes flickered with a brief moment of confusion, and then a wall seemed to go up, one that James could feel from across the room. She quickly wiped her hands on her sweater and stood, her movements stiff and deliberate, as if she wasn't sure whether to run to him or pull away. Her face, though still soft and innocent, held something that James hadn't expected. Fear. A child's fear. "Mia," he said, his voice trembling just slightly as he took a step forward. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years, rehearsed it in his head. But none of those fantasies had prepared him for this moment when his daughter looked at him as if he were a stranger. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small, uncertain. Her lips trembled slightly, and she hugged her arms across her chest, a gesture that seemed to protect her from something, though he wasn't sure what. The sound of her voice, soft and distant, hit him harder than any of the harsh words from the divorce ever had. She was still his little girl, but she wasn't the same Mia who had once begged him to read her bedtime stories or run through the sprinkler on hot summer days. "Hey, sweetie," James said, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm so sorry I haven't been around. I came to see you. I missed you." Mia didn't answer right away. She glanced away from him, her eyes darting to the toys and books scattered around the room, but she didn't make a move to play or to ask him to stay. The silence between them stretched, awkward and thick, like a veil he wasn't sure how to lift. "I've been thinking about you a lot," James continued, his voice breaking slightly as he tried to push through the unease in the room. "I got you a present for your birthday." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the charm bracelet, holding it out to her. It was small, delicate, with a star pendant that sparkled in the dim light of the room. Mia's eyes flickered to the bracelet, and for a moment, James saw something in her gaze, a glimmer of recognition, of warmth. But it was fleeting. The moment passed too quickly, replaced by the same guarded expression. She took a step back, glancing over at the neatly made bed in the corner of the room, her gaze fixed on the stuffed animals lined up at the foot. "I don't need a present," she said quietly, her voice distant, almost as if she were speaking to herself rather than to him. "Mom says I have to earn hugs. I have to be good before I can get anything." James's heart twisted in his chest at her words. Earn hugs. What did she mean by that? What kind of life had she been living that made her feel she had to earn affection, to be good before receiving something as simple and pure as love? "Earn hugs," he repeated, stepping forward a little, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't make sense of it, couldn't reconcile this with the image of the daughter he had once known. Spontaneous, full of joy, unafraid to show love or ask for it. Mia nodded, her tiny hands clasping together as if she were bracing herself for something. "Mom says I can't get hugs unless I finish my chores, unless I'm helpful." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at the floor, her eyes welling up with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had been absent from her life for so long, but this was something he hadn't even imagined. How could Celeste, how could the woman he once loved, do this to their daughter? Force her to work for affection. It was as if Mia's very right to be loved had been turned into a transaction, a set of rules to follow instead of a natural expression of care. "Baby girl," James whispered, his heart breaking as he crouched down to her level, gently taking her hands in his. "You don't have to earn hugs. You don't have to do anything for me to love you." His voice cracked, the weight of the years between them bearing down on him. Mia didn't look up at him, but he saw the way her hands trembled in his grip. She was trying so hard to hold it together, to keep the tears from escaping, But it was clear that the pressure, the constant need to be perfect and deserving, was wearing her down. "Why do you think you have to do all this, Mia?" James asked softly, his thumb brushing the back of her hand as he spoke. "Why do you have to clean and work so hard just to get love?" Mia stayed silent for a long time, her gaze still fixed on the floor. She seemed to be lost in thought, her small shoulders shaking slightly. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "Because if I don't do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Mom says, she says I'm a bad girl. That if I don't help out, I'll be a burden." James felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. A bad girl. Celeste had called their daughter a burden. The very idea of it made his blood run cold. How could she have twisted Mia's sense of self-worth like that? How had things gotten so far gone that Mia felt like her love and value depended on her ability to clean, to perform, to act like a little adult? "Sweetheart," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are not a burden. You never have been. You're my daughter, and I love you with all my heart, no matter what. You don't have to do anything to make me love you." Mia finally met his eyes, and for the first time since he walked into the room, he saw something soften in her expression, a flicker of hope, of longing. But it was quickly masked, replaced by that same guarded expression she had worn since he first entered the room. "I miss you," she whispered. "I want things to be like they used to be." James closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. He had missed so much of her growing up. So many moments he could never get back. But he was here now, and he would do everything in his power to fix this, to show Mia that she was worthy of love, not because of what she did, but because she was his daughter. "I'm so sorry, Mia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, I'm never going to leave you again. We'll figure this out. We'll fix it together." And for the first time in years, he felt a tiny spark of hope ignite deep within him. It wasn't too late. Not yet. The quiet that followed seemed to stretch endlessly, a silence filled with unspoken words and heavy emotions. James held his daughter's small hands gently in his own, the feeling of her warmth against his skin grounding him in a way nothing else could. There was so much left unsaid, so much pain he hadn't anticipated facing, but now that he was here, now that he had seen his daughter's heartache, he couldn't walk away again, not without trying to make things right. Mia, her tiny fingers still trembling in his grasp, took a hesitant step back, her eyes never leaving his face. She seemed to be weighing him, unsure of whether to trust the man before her, the one who had been a shadow in her life for so long. It hurt to think about how much time they had lost, how many moments they could never get back. He had always told himself he'd be there for her, but now, in the midst of this quiet moment, he realized that being there wasn't enough. He had been absent when it mattered most. "Do you want to talk?" James asked softly, leaning down so he could meet her gaze at eye level. His heart was heavy, but he needed to understand. He needed to hear her truth, to know what she had been going through all this time. Mia hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm not enough," she said, her voice small and unsure, the words tumbling out of her like they had been bottled up for far too long. "Like no matter how hard I try, it's never good enough. Mom says I need to help more, do more, but it's not enough. I can never make her happy." The pain in her words struck James harder than any of the business challenges he had ever faced, harder than any late-night meetings or boardroom negotiations. His daughter, his little girl, felt like she wasn't enough. How had it come to this? How had Celeste, the woman he had once loved, allowed their daughter to believe that love was something she had to earn through perfection? "No, Mia," James said, his voice a low, firm whisper. "You are more than enough. You're perfect just the way you are. And I'm so sorry you've been made to feel otherwise." He reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped her eye. "You don't have to do anything to be loved. You've always been enough. And I should have told you that sooner. Mia sniffled and shook her head, her lip trembling, as if she were holding back a flood of emotions. But if I'm not good, if I don't help enough, Mom says I'm bad. She tells me I have to be responsible, that I'm the grown-up now. I have to clean and cook and take care of everything. I can't just be a kid. The weight of her words felt like a suffocating weight on James's chest. This wasn't just about a mother demanding chores from a daughter. It was about a child being forced into a role she wasn't ready for, a child being stripped of her innocence, her right to simply exist as a little girl. It was clear now that Mia had been carrying a burden she should never have had to bear. And her mother, Celeste, had turned that burden into a wall between them, a wall that James now had to break down if he had any hope of saving his daughter. "Mia," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though his emotions were a storm inside him. "You are a little girl. You shouldn't have to worry about grown-up things. I don't care what anyone says. You don't have to be responsible for anything other than being yourself. And I'll make sure that you don't have to carry that weight anymore." Her eyes widened at his words, the confusion in them slowly giving way to a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps. But it was fragile. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and in that moment, James could see the longing in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that things could change. But the walls Celeste had built around their family were high, and Mia's trust had been shattered too many times for it to be repaired overnight. "I don't know how to fix it," James said, his voice rough. "But I will. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. You and I will figure this out together. You don't have to do any of this alone anymore." Mia didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back again, slowly, as though trying to process his words. The room felt heavy with the weight of everything they had yet to say. The distance between them was still there, but it was smaller now, more like a gap they could eventually bridge if given enough time, enough patience. Do you want to stay with me?" James asked before he could stop himself, the question slipping out before he could think it through. It wasn't a question he had prepared for, not one he had ever expected to ask. But now that he had said it, it felt like the only thing that mattered. Maya looked at him, her gaze unreadable for a long moment. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, as if the words were stuck in her throat. James could see her inner turmoil, the hope she dared not entertain, the fear that had been ingrained in her for so long. She didn't know how to answer, didn't know if it was even possible to say what she wanted. I don't know," she finally whispered. "I just want things to be normal. I want to be happy again." James's heart cracked at her words. Normal. Happy. The things she wanted were simple, things no child should have to fight for. He couldn't promise her that everything would change overnight, but he could promise that he would fight for her, for their family, no matter the cost. "You will be happy again, Mia. I swear it. I'll make sure of it," James said, the conviction in his voice stronger than ever. "I'll never give up on you." As if hearing those words for the first time, Mia's face softened. The tiny flicker of hope in her eyes grew a little brighter, though it was still fragile. But it was there, and that was enough for now. "Do you want to see the treehouse?" Maya asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was a question that seemed so simple, so innocent, but to James, it felt like the first real connection between them in years. She was offering him a part of her life that he hadn't seen in far too long. "I'd love to," James said, his voice filled with tenderness. He stood up, holding out his hand to her. "Lead the way." Mia hesitated for just a moment before she reached out and took his hand. For the first time since he'd arrived, she didn't seem afraid to be close to him. And that small gesture, her hand in his, felt like the first real step toward healing. As they walked toward the backyard, James could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. He had so much work to do, so much to prove. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He had found his daughter again. And no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to let her go. Not this time. The treehouse was a little oasis, hidden at the far corner of the backyard beneath the shade of a large oak tree. It was far from the pristine, perfectly manicured lawn that characterized the rest of the house, and that felt like a relief to James. The small wooden structure, weathered by time and the elements, seemed to be a sanctuary, a place untouched by the perfection Celeste demanded in every corner of their lives. It was real. It was raw. And most importantly, it was a space where Mia could truly be herself. As Mia led him through the overgrown grass and toward the ladder that ascended into the treehouse, James couldn't help but notice the slight hesitancy in her steps. There was an uncertainty in the way she moved, like a child who had been asked to play a role far too big for her, yet still yearned for the simplicity of her childhood. The innocence that should have defined her early years had been marred by too many responsibilities, too many expectations placed on her by a mother who seemed intent on molding her into something she wasn't ready to be. James swallowed the lump in his throat as they reached the base of the ladder. He could feel the weight of the promise he had made to her, the promise to protect her, to fight for her happiness. The truth that had been gnawing at him for so long was now undeniable. He had failed her, not in the way he had once imagined. He had never abused her or neglected her physically, but in the ways that mattered most. He had been absent, emotionally unavailable, too consumed by his own world to recognize the little girl who had needed him the most. And now, years later, she was asking him to help her piece together a broken life, a task he wasn't sure he was prepared for. But as Mia's small hand reached up to grasp the first rung of the ladder, he pushed those thoughts aside. It wasn't about what he had failed to do in the past. It was about what he could do now. And right now, he could be present. He could show up. "You go first," Maya said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the rustling leaves above them. She looked up at the treehouse, her eyes softening for just a moment. It was a quiet gesture, but James understood it. She was offering him the opportunity to take the lead, to guide her up into this tiny haven that had been hers for so long, a place where she could escape the demands of a world that felt too heavy for her. James nodded and stepped forward, his hand steady as he grasped the rungs of the ladder. It creaked under his weight, the old wood groaning in protest as he began to ascend. The climb was short, but it gave him time to think, time to gather his thoughts. His mind raced as he thought about Celeste, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had become a stranger. How had things gone so wrong? How had they let their marriage fall apart in such a messy, irreversible way? But the truth was, it wasn't just Celeste. James had played his part in the unraveling. He had distanced himself, buried himself in work, in the pursuit of success, and in the fear of failure. The fear of failing his daughter had kept him away, kept him from being the father he needed to be. Now, climbing up to that treehouse, James realized that this moment, the one where he was choosing to show up for Mia, was the first step toward redemption. He reached the top of the ladder and turned to offer his hand to Mia. She hesitated for a moment, looking up at him with a mixture of uncertainty and longing. He could see it, the way she wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that things could be different, but was afraid to give herself over completely, afraid of being hurt again. "It's okay," James said softly, his voice reassuring. "You can trust me. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Slowly, cautiously, Mia took his hand and climbed up after him. James steadied her, guiding her up into the small treehouse that seemed so much more magical now than it had ever appeared in his mind. The walls were lined with faded drawings and little trinkets that Mia had collected over the years: feathers, a broken pencil, a half-finished puzzle. The room smelled faintly of wood and earth, the scent of a child's imagination at work. Mia sat down on the wooden floor, her legs crossed beneath her. James joined her, sitting cross-legged across from her, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath him. They didn't speak for a long time. The quiet was comforting, not awkward, just the two of them sitting there together, with nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant hum of life beyond the backyard. "Mia," James finally said, breaking the silence, "you don't have to carry all of this alone. I'm here now, and I'll be here for you, no matter what." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, a spark of hope flickering behind the guarded look she had been wearing for so long. "But what if? What if Mom doesn't like it? What if she doesn't want you around?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened before, everything that had led to this moment. James could feel the tension in the question, the fear that had been planted in Mia's heart over the years. Celeste's influence was powerful, and James knew that this wasn't going to be easy. But he also knew that he couldn't let her words and actions dictate the course of Mia's future. "Mia," he said gently, "this isn't about what your mom wants or doesn't want. This is about you and me. This is about us, and the time we've lost. I'm not here to take you away from her or cause any trouble. I'm here to make sure you know that you're loved, just for who you are. Not because of what you do, not because of what anyone says you should do. You deserve to feel safe, to feel happy." Mia was silent for a long moment, her gaze lowered as she processed his words. The weight of the conversation was palpable, the air between them thick with all the things they hadn't said yet. James could feel her beginning to let go of some of the walls she had built around herself, bit by bit. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that they could rebuild something together, hope that he could make up for the time he had lost, and hope that Mia could find the peace she so desperately needed. "I don't want to go back," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be stuck in that house anymore. It's so lonely. I don't know what to do." James's heart clenched at her words. She was just a little girl, and she shouldn't have to feel this way. She shouldn't have to carry the weight of loneliness and responsibility. The thought of her, trapped in that house, trying to please a mother who seemed incapable of seeing her for who she truly was, broke him. "I won't let you go back to that," James said, his voice firm with conviction. "We'll figure it out, Mia. I promise you, we will. You don't have to feel alone anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were different this time. Not the tears of sadness and confusion he had seen earlier, but something else, something that looked like the beginning of healing. A glimmer of trust, a glimmer of hope. "I believe you," she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for his hand once again. James squeezed it gently, the weight of that simple gesture carrying more than any words ever could. They sat together in the treehouse for what felt like hours, the bond between them slowly strengthening with each passing moment. James didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he believed that it could be brighter, because they were in it together. And that was enough. The morning after their time in the treehouse, the air felt different, charged with possibility. James had woken up early, unable to sleep through the night, his thoughts racing in 1,000 directions. The image of Mia's hopeful face, her small hand gripping his in that quiet moment, replayed in his mind like a soothing melody. It was a spark, something raw and unrefined, but full of potential, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference in her life. Maybe he could start rebuilding the trust that had been shattered over the years. But as he prepared to leave the treehouse and return to the house, he knew the battle was far from over. He couldn't erase the past, the months and years of missed birthdays, ignored phone calls, and formal letters from lawyers. The walls that Celeste had built were high, and she was a woman who took no chances, especially when it came to Mia. She had always been meticulous, calculating, and protective in ways that bordered on controlling. James had seen that control in the way she held Mia close, in the way she tried to shield their daughter from anything she perceived as a threat to her version of the world. He knew that showing up unexpectedly, however well-intentioned, would be met with resistance, and perhaps even anger. But that didn't matter anymore. The time for making excuses, for waiting for the perfect moment, was over. He had already made the choice. The first step was the hardest, But now that he was here, in this place with Mia, he couldn't walk away. Not again. After a long, quiet breakfast where neither of them said much, Mia had returned to her room to finish her drawings. James, feeling like he was on borrowed time, had done what he could to prepare for the storm he was certain was coming. He had tried to reach Celeste earlier that morning, but as expected, there was no response. She was always careful to avoid direct communication when it suited her, relying instead on lawyers and messages that carried an air of formality that James had grown to resent. But he was done waiting for permission, done hiding from the guilt that had followed him for so long. He stepped out of the house, his heart pounding as he made his way to the rental car parked at the edge of the driveway. The decision felt monumental, yet in some ways, it was deceptively simple. His only choice now was to show up for Mia in ways that went beyond the superficial gestures that had failed her in the past. He wasn't going to be the distant, apologetic father anymore. He was going to be the one who walked beside her, who fought for her when the world seemed too cold. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. As James drove toward the city center, the streets became busier. The once sleepy morning transformed into the hustle of an ordinary day. Yet for him, everything felt different. His thoughts were preoccupied with Mia and what the next steps would be. He had a plan. Sort of. He was going to visit a lawyer, find out what his rights were, and start building a case for more involvement in Mia's life. But beneath the legalities and the formalities, James knew the real work lay in the emotional terrain. In the past, he had been the absentee father, the one who said, "I'm sorry," through gifts and letters, but never through actions. That had to change. The meeting with the lawyer was a blur of terms and conditions, things he didn't want to hear, but knew he had to understand. He walked out of the office more drained than he had anticipated, his mind still processing all the possible outcomes. The lawyer had been helpful, outlining his rights as a father, but also warning him that Celeste would fight him every step of the way. She was a master of manipulation, and she knew how to play the system. But James had a fire in him now, a fire that he hadn't felt in years. If it meant fighting for Mia, even in the face of the hardest battles, he would. But as the day wore on, and the decisions began to feel like they were stacking up one after another, James couldn't help but feel a sense of exhaustion creeping in. He thought of Mia, her sweet face, her quiet demeanor, the vulnerability that seemed to emanate from her in a way he had never noticed before. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind to the emotional toll his absence had taken on her? That night, as he sat in the small, temporary apartment he had rented during his stay, he couldn't stop thinking about how little he knew of his own daughter's life. Sure, he had seen her in photos, heard stories through the thin veil of legal exchanges, but that wasn't enough. He wasn't a spectator anymore. He wasn't content to stand at the sidelines. He had to be a part of her world, to see her struggles and her triumphs firsthand. He realized with a sinking heart that his previous attempts to reconnect had been selfish, centered more around his need to feel better about his own failings as a father than about Mia's needs. There was so much left unsaved between them, so much that had gone unaddressed in the years they had been apart. But that night, as James sat on the couch, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city below, he made a vow. A vow that went beyond fighting for his parental rights. It was a promise to himself that he would never stop fighting for Mia's well-being, no matter what it took, no matter how long it took. The next morning, he went back to the house, where he found Mia sitting at the kitchen table with a sketchpad in front of her. Her eyes were tired, but there was a certain determination in her posture, a quiet strength that made James pause. She was drawing again, just like she had the day before, creating worlds on paper where she could be whoever she wanted to be, freed from the constraints of the life that had been imposed on her. "Mia," James said softly, as he leaned against the doorframe, watching her. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "What is it, Dad?" James took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if there was a right way to say this, but he knew there was no more room for hesitation. "I'm not going to give up on you. Not now. Not ever." I'm here to stay." Mia didn't say anything for a moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or the truth in his words. Finally, she smiled, a small, tentative smile. It wasn't wide, but it was enough. Enough to give James the hope he needed to take the next step, and the next after that. In that moment, he realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the battle for Mia's future wouldn't be fought in one grand gesture or court hearing. It would be fought in the small, everyday moments. The times he showed up, the moments he listened, the quiet assurances he gave her when the world felt too loud. They had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just showing up for Mia. He was showing up for himself too, for the father he had failed to be, and the father he was going to become. Together, they would find their way forward.